Is Andrew Rawnsley there? I heard his voice earlier.
I hope so.
Yeah, that looks like you. Yeah, good. Are you well?
I noticed Chris checking his mic, so I'm expecting to be harassed from Chris during the the talk.
Oh, well, we'll shut him up if he can use it. So you're on for the next couple of hours.
Until everybody falls asleep, I think.
Yeah, Sophia talk and Q&A, and then there'll be a half-hour sort of lunch break so people can go and get a bite to eat, go to the loo, whatever else they want to do. So, well, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed. Am I full screen? Or it's still? Yeah, there we are. Super. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm normally doing an afternoon slot, so it's interesting to be doing a first thing in the morning. Well, for me, first thing in the morning slot. Good to see everybody here. I'm going to start by talking about RISC OS developments and the various projects that Riscos Developments has been working on. The first hour, broadly speaking, will be Riscos Developments. Second hour, broadly speaking, will be RComp and RComp Interactive. If there's time, there'll be questions and answers between each. If not, we'll have to do all the questions and answers at the end of the RComp session. Apologies. I'm seeing that it's saying that I'm very quiet. Somebody else is saying the volume is fine there, so I'll assume we're okay. Okay, super. Right, we're going to start on Riscos Developments with a look at the new pinboard that we're developing. For a little bit of background first, for those unfamiliar with Riscos Developments, the company was set up a few years back, I think probably 3 or 4 years back now, initially to develop a state-of-the-art web browser project for RISC OS, and that has expanded over time when the opportunity to actually purchase the RISC OS IPR came up when Castle needed to exit the market for financial reasons. Riscos Developments has taken on the whole of the RISC OS IPR, and now that we actually own the operating system, clearly we want to see that operating system flourish and be used all over the world. So the company has, over the last few years, initiated a number of projects with the goal of improving, expanding, and increasing the market and audience for RISC OS, because the last thing we want to do is see the audience dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. Instead, we want to see RISC OS growing and finding home in uses all around the world. And that's been a successful project for us. We've seen interest from RISC OS from the 4 corners of the globe. And through projects like Riscos Direct, which I'll talk about later, we're finding new users and drawing people in at the younger end and the traditional older end too. One of the things that we are looking at with RISC OS is how to tastefully improve the experience of the operating system so that new users feel more comfortable and existing users get more functionality. And one of the big areas that we felt had languished for a long time was the pinboard. This takes up most of the space on your screen, apart from the icon bar, and yet has always been a fairly passive thing. You can place icons on it, save that, and have a wallpaper, and that was pretty much it. Other operating systems had rather passed Riscos by when it came to their desktops, and so we felt that the RISC OS pinboard was a good place to start in enhancing the operating system. I'm now going to screen share onto my ARMX6, and hopefully you'll be able to see my Riscos desktop. Is that working?
Yes.
Super, that's great. So at the moment, I'm running the traditional RISC OS pinboard. If we press menu, you can see only a few options. Got a few things pinned, and that's pretty much all there is to it. I'm now going to load the new pinboard 2, which you can beta test today simply by dropping us an email and requesting access to the test version. We will email you back a copy of the test version, and there's no strings attached on that. Anybody who's interested in trying out pinboard 2, just write to us We're more than happy to provide you with a copy. So I've now loaded the new pin board. You'll notice that the icons that were previously pinned to the pin board have red pin icons in them now. This is to distinguish between items that are pinned to the pin board, in other words, applications that may live elsewhere on your hard drive, and files and documents that we can now save to the pin board. It's worth digressing very slightly to the pinned items because they're somewhat unique on Riscos. Traditionally, every file that you see on a Riscos machine corresponds to an actual file on your drive. And the pin board is one of the very few ways that a RISC OS computer can actually have links from one location to another. So things that you pin on the pin board live all over your hard drive, but they actually appear in one place on the pin board. So in order to indicate that, we now have the pin icon. Conversely, I can say start a text document. And I can now save that text file to the pin board. And you will notice that that text file does not have a pin icon in it because it is saved to the pin board. And this is how we can now distinguish between items that are pinned and items that live on the pin board itself. The actual location is fully configurable, so you can choose where it stores it. By default, it's in the pin board folder within boot choices, but you could set that anywhere you like. Files on the pin board have access to a usual filer menu. They can be copied, renamed, deleted. You can count the size of them and bring up file info, etc., just like an ordinary filer window. So the pin board on pin board 2 is treated just like a folder or in the filer that you would normally use. The icons on the pin board can now also be pinned in place, because a lot of people were reporting that they were dragging icons around by accident. So we can now lock the position of icons. And now if we try and drag these icons, they're now fixed in place. Makes it much more convenient to use your desktop when you're not overly accurate with the mouse. You don't find yourself accidentally copying and moving things around or dragging things into places you don't want. Again, just highlight it, selection, unlock the position, and then they're back to normal. You'll see up here that we have what we call a sticky note. Sticky notes are a new aspect of Pinboard 2. You create a sticky note simply by pressing the menu button and going New Sticky. They are writable text areas that you can adjust the size of. You can change the colors, you can give them a title, and you can see when I put my pointer over it, it's got the Riscos Developments title. And these are some notes for what I'm going to be talking about during the talk. You can edit those, you can export the text, you can set the colors, you can change the fonts. So for example, I usually quite like putting things in Sassoon for sticky notes. I think the slightly handwritten look looks quite nice for a sticky note. So I can change that there. Pinboard 2 will automatically save things when you shut down, although that is configurable. And indeed, almost all the functionality is configurable in the new Configure plugin. If I press Menu, as before, I can click Configure, and you can see that there are now multiple sections to the new pinboard. Starting with the background, the image that I'm using on here is actually a very, very wide one designed for a 3440-1440 resolution monitor. At the moment, we're using standard scaling, which scales to the space above the icon bar. New feature in Pinboard 2 is the full screen option. If I click that and set, you'll notice that things seem to move down a little bit in the background. This uses the full resolution of your desktop, including the space behind the icon bar. You may wonder what the point of that is, but that's how operating systems like Windows and Mac work, where if you have a 1080p backdrop, it fills the whole of a 1080p screen, including behind the taskbar or menu bars, etc. This means that if you've got a 1080p backdrop that you've downloaded off the internet and you use it on Riscos, it doesn't have to be artificially scaled or modified. It can just be placed on the pin board and used in the same way that it could be used on a Windows or Mac machine. Previously, you would generally either have to have a scaling factor applied, or you'd end up having to trim the image to fit because of the Riscos icon bar. You'll also see that there's a carousel option, the idea being that you can have multiple backdrops and cycle through them as you go. That's a feature that's still being developed at the time being, so watch this space for that. There are also plain colors, the standard image, and you can set a background color. Under the appearance, we can choose the colors. We can use font blending, which I ought to have turned on because the backgrounds to those text icons look very ugly. You can see now that once I turn on font blending, the icons blend properly with the background. We also have a draw outlined text option, which will put a shaded outline on the text. This will make it sure that text is always visible no matter the background color. So for example, if you have white text on a white background, the outline text will make that white text visible, much in the same way that Windows has a shading effect around its text when used on the desktop. We've also, if I go back there, we've also introduced the ability to choose the size of the icons on the pin board. We can now have large icons, and let's blow it up. You see, this is why things are alpha and beta. Fantastic. I'm now unfortunately going to have to restart that machine. So I will keep talking while the computer restarts. We've added the ability to do differently sized icons on the pin board. So, for example, some people like to cram as much information as possible on. They can use the small icons option. Meanwhile, we've added the big icons option for people who perhaps don't see as clearly. And if you choose that option, it will make use of Sprites 11 files, which are double detail files that many applications include, as well as the standard RISC OS ROM set, which includes Sprites 11 version of most of the RISC OS desktop. Excuse me for one moment. Just looking after the machine that's rebooting. Not my lucky day today with the pin board demonstration, unfortunately.
It's what they call the law of product demonstrations. You know, the more important to customers, the less chance it is for actually working.
Yes, to be honest with you, I use it almost every day. Well, in fact, I do use it all day, every day, and I've never had any crashes out of it. So it's typical that we would see a problem once we try and tackle the exhibition. Other features of Pinboard 2 include the ability to cache image conversions. So historically, if you used a JPEG as a backdrop for the Riscos desktop, it would try and constantly re-decode that JPEG, which would actually slow the whole computing experience down. The Pinboard 2 will allow you to cache the conversion so that the conversion is done once and then can be done can be reproduced at full speed every time. That also allows you to use a wide range of image formats. So you can use PNG, you can use GIF, TIFF, basically any format that you can open with Change FSI is now usable as a desktop background. Beyond that, we've also added various minor features like the ability to use draw files on the pinboard to add watermarks to the corner of the screen. You'll see that later. And various smaller improvements to make the pinboard feel more modern and more useful. Right, okay. Finally, we're back. Hopefully you can see a desktop again, and hopefully if I run Pinboard 2, okay, we're back up and running. Super. As I described earlier, the pinboard location can be changed. You can choose whether it saves on exit and how it deals with overwriting files that are already on the pinboard. You can also control the setup of your stickies, the arrangement of the icons, and where possible, we've tried to maintain compatibility with the old pinboard in terms of the syntax and the files, as well as incorporating elements of the syntax used on Riscos Adjust, so that pinboard files can be used across different generations of computer. Indeed, Pinboard 2 is quite happy running on a virtual Acorn system with Riscos 4.02 or 4.39, as well as on a RISC OS 5 computer. So, Pinboard 2 available now, warts and all. Please drop us an email and we're more than happy to send you a copy to play with. Next up, I'm going to talk about our work on TCP/IP networking for RISC OS, which is a major project that we started at the back end of 2020. You may have seen on the rules website various bounties that they have relating to networking. Now, at Riscos Developments, we were approached by one of our commercial partners who desperately needed the networking to be improved as quickly as possible for a project that they were working on. So without resorting to the rule bounties and therefore keeping rules funds free for other projects, we have tackled the thorny issue of networking on RISC OS and have developed a new TCP/IP stack, which is based on a modern OpenBSD networking stack. This incorporates features of IPv4 and IPv6 and also has the stack level support for wireless networking and all the modern networking features that you would expect in a modern TCP/IP stack. The work is, dare I say it, mostly complete. And indeed, this demonstration and this desktop that you're seeing is in fact running entirely on the new stack. And pretty much everybody inside Riscos Developments is now running the new stack on their computer. So if I do help internet, you will see that this is running on 5.83 dated 22nd of March 2021. The only feature that is preventing us making a beta release at the moment is that we don't yet have DHCP fully working. But the way it's implemented in the new stack is unlike anything else, I think would be the way to describe it. It makes use of a number of facilities that are sort of more Unixy, more Linuxy in nature, that are not traditionally available on RISC OS. So we have had to implement various messaging systems within the internet module to allow RISC OS to present those interfaces in a way that it will be friendly for DHCP use. I'm told that it's almost there, but didn't quite make it for the show. At the moment, we have drivers for the ARMX6 EtherTH, which has been the main development platform. primarily because that's the platform that's going to be deployed commercially. But we also have an Ether USB version, which has been worked up as a demonstration for programmers as to how to set up and work with drivers and how to create their own drivers. And as of lunchtime yesterday, we also have the guts of a Pi 4 driver, although that wasn't quite up to being demonstrated at the show. It has some issues with VNC server, which is what I'm using to share the desktop, so that would have been rather awkward in terms of using it for a demonstration. But the EtherTH ARMX6 driver seems incredibly solid, and pretty much every program that we test with it is now working, including things like Landman 98, which wasn't working last time I showed you, so I can sort of go to apps, get Landman 98, access my NAS. You can see there. Just go straight in. The new stack hasn't yet been optimized for speed, but anecdotal reports are of significantly better performance than the standard RISC OS 5 TCP/IP stack. We've written the code to be as compatible as possible with everything that's gone before. So that's why programs like Landman 98 simply work without modification. And indeed, every program that I'm demonstrating is the same version that you would use on the normal stack. We haven't had to modify any applications for use with the new TCP/IP stack. It actually goes even further than that, because we've made several of the components of the new stack such that they will work on the old stack so that they can be integrated more quickly with the main rule build of Riscos. This is particularly because some of the old modules used in the networking were closed source due to license reasons. And these have been implemented from scratch in the new stack in such a way that they will run on both old and new stack equally, depending on what functionality is available. So modules such as MBUF Manager and Resolver now exist in open source versions. In fact, that means that there's only one element of RISC OS that is now subject to non-disclosure if you want to develop it. And that particular element is not something that anybody who is using commercial RISC OS would likely to want to use. So as far as a commercial RISC OS user is, or customer is concerned now, we have truly open source elements for all the core modules that you would want to use, which is quite important. It's hoped that those new open source Resolver and MBUF Manager modules will appear very shortly through the Rule nightly beta system. And the main TCP/IP stack is intended to be offered for public beta through Rule in the coming months. Of particular interest is the fact that this now supports IPv6, and the new Resolver module also supports both IPv4 and IPv6. IPv6 requires expanded commands to cope with the syntax of IPv6, unfortunately. But what we've done there, with a little bit of foresight, we hope, is created in the new Resolver module the ability to use one SWI on both the old and the new stack to do IPv6 compliant resolves. So basically, it detects what version of the stack is running on, and it will resolve accordingly. So if you do a resolve request with the new syntax on the old stack, you will get IPv4 and it will work. And if you do the resolve on the new stack, it will resolve to IPv6 and IPv4 through the new stack with the same command. This means that programmers who wish to take advantage of IPv6 can begin developing code with the new module and can do so right away. That code will then work on the old stack with the old with the new Resolver, which will be open source and can be used by anybody running any version of the modern TCP/IP stack, TCP/IP stack as per sort of rule version and later. I suspect it may even work on the old Acorn era TCP/IP stack, but we haven't tested that. MBUF Manager is primarily of relevance to network driver developers, but again, that is now open source and not subject to NDAs because it's being developed completely from scratch in a clean room environment. indeed, the developer didn't even have access to any of the Acorn documentation, so that we kept it completely closed. And that allowed a completely clean room version of MBUF Manager to be created. Particularly exciting is the fact that the new stack includes the basics of Wi-Fi. There is a C source code file called 802.11, which covers the bulk of the stack level 802.11 wireless networking protocols. So in order to add wireless to the new TCP/IP stack, we simply need to create drivers for the specific pieces of hardware and bolt that into the 802.11 support that is present in the new stack. And to be honest with you, that's probably all you need to know. It's very close. We hope to have public betas in the very near future, and hope to release in cooperation with RULE. This is something that we talk about in each of our monthly meetings with RULE, and we hope that that will be coming to nightly betas as soon as possible. As I say, it's in live use on almost all the RMX6s within Riscos developments. I believe Richard has servers running on the top of it that are out sort of live on the internet. To be honest with you, it's a solid piece of code. In due course, we hope to optimize performance further, but we now have a modern TCP/IP stack running on RISC OS. That leads me conveniently into the other part of networking that we are spending a lot of time developing, and that is the new web browser. I'm going to close this particular session and screen share a different window now onto my Forte. Okay, click screen share and Forte and share. And I am now going to show you the latest version of Iris. The big news with Iris as of this month is the inclusion of a JavaScript JIT, which stands for just-in-time compiler. This basically allows the JavaScript engine to go considerably faster. In synthetic benchmarks, we've seen improvements of tenfold or more, although in practice, I think better to be more restrained, but often it's sort of doubling in JavaScript performance. For most sites, that won't make a wild amount of difference, but at certain sites are very JavaScript heavy, and they show very tangible improvements to responsiveness. So we'll look at those in a moment. Perhaps the largest news for the show, I shall just go out and say it, we have now made Iris available to anybody who has purchased at any of the previous shows our OBrowser CDs. If you bought OBrowser and you got your CD, if you look on the CD, you will find a text file that tells you how to download updates. If you go to that website, you will now find an Iris for OBrowser zip, and you will be able to access the latest version of Iris and play with it on your own machines. Iris is now, OBrowser is now also available on Pling Store. For those of you not familiar with OBrowser, OBrowser was a project that we produced for shows a few years back to allow people to buy something to contribute to Riscos development funds. It provided a front end at the time for Otter Browser, and that's still available. And we've also, in recent times, made that a way of distributing Iris, the Iris beta, to a larger audience. As I say, consider it as a donation to RISC OS development's funds. This is a very expensive project to develop, but I think you'll agree with me that the results speak for themselves. If I go to the BBC homepage, for example, you will see that we now have a browser that will accurately display the BBC homepage. You can see interactive things happening, and accurate rendering. Each of these pictures is done with JavaScript. That's how they fade the pictures in and out as you scroll down the page, although they're coming in quite quickly at the moment, so you're not really seeing that happen. Perhaps a better test of the capabilities is Google Maps, which would obviously have been a complete non-starter on previous version of a RISC OS web browser. And you can see that that has immediately gone to the area around where I live. I'm not going to point my house out, but suffice to say that somewhere in that region is Arcom Central. We can even do the little drag and drop your guy. Although this does get a wee bit slow, so you'll just have to bear with me. But there's Google Street View working on a RISC OS machine, and subject to how this will work with the VNC session, you can see that I can scroll around and use Street View as you would expect. Now, the minimum specification for Iris remains an ARMX6, but I will be honest that it does benefit from as much computer horsepower that you can throw at it, the better. So, whilst computers like Raspberry Pi 4 and Titanium don't necessarily have sort of must-have applications previously, Iris does really take advantage of the extra oomph that some of these sort of higher clock speed machines can throw at it. But nevertheless, as long as you've got a reasonably nippy RISC-OS machine like an ARMX6 or higher, you should be fine. And it will still work on sort of Raspberry Pi 2, Raspberry Pi 3, I believe, probably Panda Board 2, but make sure you're up to date on your copy of RISC OS. Essentially, the older the machine, I would imagine, the slower some of the more complex sites will be. One that everybody likes to see is Amazon. The pandemic means that I think we all seem to use Amazon a lot more than we probably ought to. You can see that we've got the full desktop Amazon website, complete with sort of sign-in menus and things. And we can search for that, and boom, there you can see that we can use Amazon just as we would on a PC. We have facilities like a hot list, bookmarks. It supports RISC OS protocols like clicking on links in email clients, double-clicking on files. We have tabbed browsing, so I can open up another tab. I came across this Electron emulator site earlier in today, which struck me as quite fun. So here we have an Acorn Electron being emulated in JavaScript in a tab in Iris. So I haven't tried Citadel, so I have no idea how that works. That seems to be there. I don't know how you play it on the Electron, but oh, there we go. I think the BBC version was a wee bit nicer, but you can see it. We're emulating an Electron in JavaScript in a web browser on Riscos. So I think that's quite a nice little demonstration. Similarly for Acorn aficionados, another fun one that came up at the meeting of Rugal. Oh, let's have a little look at my history. That was working earlier. Acorn. This takes a moment or two to come up with the first page, but then seems to be okay once it's come up. He said boldly. we are working. Okay, not entirely sure what's going on there. Oh, Acorn Atom Emulator off the table for today. It was working this morning, so I have no idea what's going on there. Possibly we've just been visiting too many other sites with that session. Favorite text sites like the Register just work beautifully. Complete with drop-down menus and the like. An interesting thing I came across the other day, which I didn't know about, was that you can save Wikipedia pages as PDF files. I hadn't spotted this before, but down the left-hand side, there's a download as PDF option. So I thought, why not try that in Iris? So we can click download. And it downloads, opens a save box. I can save that to my RAM disk. You can see the download. And now if we look in our RAM disk, there is the PDF. And for some reason, the PDFs tend to look a bit odd. You can see the colors on the graphics come out strangely in Pling PDF. But nevertheless, you can see Iris downloading files from websites. We also have uploading in the latest version. So you can upload files. I'm told it works with things like Google Calendar. And indeed, I have had Iris working with Google Docs. I don't have an example page for this. Let's just see if Google itself can help us with this. It's always dangerous when you're doing things on the fly, because you have no idea what you're going to get. So if it blows up horribly, which has been my luck so far, Google Docs is an entire Office suite written in JavaScript, so it's a pretty evil test. It's not particularly fast, but then an entire Microsoft-compatible Office suite written in JavaScript. It's not entirely surprising that it's not ridiculously fast, but it does work, and you can see it's not far. I would say it's far from unresponsive. I think it's opened it in read-only mode because we're only getting a few options. If we download it as a Microsoft Word document, what happens? Oh, yeah, download box. Oh, okay, probably shouldn't have tried that. So yeah, Iris Beta still has a few rough edges, as you see, but coming along most excellently, and basically giving a modern web experience to RISC OS users. Available now if you've got O Browser, and if you haven't got O Browser, head on over to Pling Store where you can grab a copy and make a donation to funds and have a go. In due course, Iris will be made available free of charge once we've got it to a point where we think that it's not going to be sort of falling over and causing users grief. That basically, once we can get it to a point where the tech support burden is minimal, then it will be made available free of charge, because we don't have the resources to provide extensive tech support for web browsers, which I know from the past, with my RComp hat on, can be a huge undertaking. And even at the moment, it saps a huge amount of my time, which is why the RComp talk will be a little bit less eye-popping than the Riscos developments one. Sometimes Richard and I are spending 35 hours a week or more on Riscos development, so it really does take a lot of our time to do this. But I think it's worth it, and we feel like we're really progressing things with Riscos. Next up, on our little checklist, we have Riscos Direct. Riscos Direct is a project that we started just before the pandemic hit, February last year. The goal of Riscos Direct was basically to create a version of RISC OS that would appeal to new users with as much software as we could arrange to include, so that the distribution was ready to go. You plug it into a Raspberry Pi, and it was backed up by a video series, so you could follow the video series and be introduced to RISC OS with our partners at Wi-Fi Sheep, and basically present a nice modern RISC OS ready to go, ready to download, and use that to essentially evangelize RISC OS with new users. The actual project, we brought in a huge supply of SD cards so that we could go out to Pi Jams and distribute cards to people, and actually encourage new users to try RISC OS by basically removing the barrier to entry. That just simply give them the card, or engage them in conversation first, give them a card if they seemed interested, and then they could literally just plug that into their Pi and try Riscos. Of course, this project was completely scuppered by the arrival of the pandemic, and all the Pi Jams shut down. So Richard has a big bag of SD cards in his shed, awaiting the time when the pandemic is finally lifted, and we can finally go and make those cards available to the people who we want to share Riscos with. In the meantime, Riscos Direct provides an excellent fully featured RISC OS for anybody to download and use. As of earlier this year, we now support Raspberry Pi 4 and Raspberry Pi 400, and the system is designed to auto-detect networking. So depending on whether you plug it into an old Pi or a new Pi, it will auto-detect the necessary networking configuration, so that regardless of whether you're using Ether USB or Ether TH, just plug the card in, turn it on, connect a network cable, and off you go. You'll have RISC OS on the internet straight away. That's pretty much it for Riscos Direct, I think. We're going to continue to expand that in due course. Riscos Direct remains our preferred way to share RISC OS with new users, and we're going to continue working with Wi-Fi Sheep to produce videos and use the whole project to try and bolster RISC OS's attraction to new users, returning users, and basically anybody who wants to use Riscos. And it does work. We've had inquiries relating to RISC OS commercial and semi-commercial projects from as far away as, I think, Paraguay, Japan. Funny enough, we had one week where we had several inquiries, all from different parts of Japan, which was most peculiar. There's interest in Russia, there's interest all across Europe, Australia, quite a lot now from North America and Canada. So RISC OS really is getting an international uptake. I think, what we're all doing, it's not just Riscos developments, it's Rule as well. And it's, all the different Riscos companies that are represented today. We're putting out a positive message now to a global audience that RISC OS is worth paying attention to, be it through the open sourcing with the Apache 2 license of the RISC OS code base, whether it's Riscos Direct, whether it's the broad range of hardware that RISC OS now runs on, it's exciting times. So moving down my little checklist, the next thing that we have is Python 3. Not much to say here beyond that Python 3 is now available. You can download it. It's the easiest way to get it is through Pacman because it has various dependencies that Pacman will sort out for you. It now tracks to the latest version of Python 3 as far as I know. And it even got a shout out from Python 3 creators on Twitter. When they heard that RISC OS was now running the latest version, they were or seemed to be mighty impressed. So yeah, RISC OS up there with modern operating systems running the latest Python 3. There's still work to be done. None of the C modules that you can use to expand Python 3 work as yet, but all the Python 3 or pure Python libraries should be working as far as I know. So you've got things like Pygame to allow you to do graphics and sound through Python. And I believe someone's written a Riscos toolbox Python demonstration, so you can write Riscos desktop applications in Python. So yeah, Python is an important part of modern programming. It's what kids learn at school. It's basically the basic, of the 21st century, and RISC OS runs the latest version of it. So yeah. So we've kind of ticked that project off on the checkbox, although obviously it will take time to keep updating it to track the latest versions. New releases this year, Landman 98 we've taken on, we've open sourced it with a very permissive license, CDDL. Some minor tweaks cosmetically. I think you saw it running very briefly when I did my TCP/IP demonstration earlier. Goal is to expand Landman 98 / Landman FS with more modern protocols. The current version of Landman, both Landman FS and Landman 98, implement version 1 of the CIFS protocol. The rest of the world is now on CIFS 3, so we want to move towards that. Apparently the biggest hurdle, because some work has already been done, biggest hurdle relates to the fact that everything is now Unicode in terms of text handling, file name handling, and basically all text is Unicode in CIFS 3, which, although that is nominally supported in RISC OS 5, the filer currently doesn't support Unicode, which means that everything has to go through translation layers. And of course, that's an absolute pig of a grind for a programmer to make sure every text operation in a network filing system is passed through appropriate encode, decode, Unicode operations. And so the particular person who's working on that is basically finding it somewhat tedious, I think would be the way to phrase it. But work is ongoing on that. I have had my jab. Impression, not a lot to say here. Impression style freely available. You can grab it on Plingstore. Even if you're a die-hard impression user using your own version, I'd strongly recommend grabbing the 2019 version of style. It is tweaked as much as we can within the sort of 26-bit limitations, so you do need Emula, but it has revised manual documentation. We've updated some of the user interface elements. There are, tastefully though, in ways you wouldn't necessarily realize. So it feels like the same application, but it's just been modernized. It handles Emula transparently, so you don't need, it loses it when it needs it, doesn't when it doesn't. And basically, it's the latest and greatest version of impression style that we could produce. So if you haven't tried that out, certainly give it a try. Impression's a fantastic program, and you'll be amazed at just how much you can do with style. I mean, although that's technically the junior member of the family, honestly, it does 95% of what the bigger versions seem to do. The main limitations are lack of irregular shaped frames and some of the sort of more advanced color handling in terms of CMYK. And honestly, majority of users won't be needing the CMYK stuff, swap colors, and so on. And the irregular shaped frames are nice, I grant you, but quite frankly, as I say, I think you'll just be amazed at how much style will do totally for free. Work is continuing on Impression X. We hope to have more news on that later this summer. But I don't want to get tied down to specific dates because we all know what happens when that occurs. Looks like we've got about 10 minutes left before we reach the 12:30 end of part 1 cutoff. So I'll just talk briefly about the future of Riscos and then open up to a few questions. Obviously, you've seen a lot of the future today in the talk that I've just given you. Riscos Development's absolutely committed to developing more projects, supporting the whole community through projects that we're doing, supporting Rule with their bounty scheme, and just generally cooperating with anybody who wants to cooperate with us in terms of developing Riscos and improving it forwards. We have a roadmap that includes addressing things like the Unicode issues that we talked about earlier, and various things I don't really want to talk about just yet. But suffice to say, there is a plan. And a big part of that plan going forwards is going to have to be the 64-bit issue. This is the big looming challenge on the horizon of RISC OS, because modern ARM processors are moving to an exclusively 64-bit architecture. If you look at the new ARM v9 standard, Riscos currently runs on ARM v7, ARM v8 processors in 32-bit mode. ARM v9 essentially makes 32-bit completely optional, and even then, it only runs in a sort of user mode rather than supervisor mode. Have been people come up with possible workarounds for this, but all of this presupposes that any processor ARM v9 architecture actually includes any kind of 32-bit support, which I think is pretty unlikely, to be perfectly honest with you, that we're already seeing 64-bit only ARMs from the majority of manufacturers with the latest ARM architectures. So by the time ARM v9 becomes the standard, I honestly can't see 32-bit modes being in anything but the budget end processors. So 64-bit is definitely something that we need to be thinking about and tackling as soon as possible. We are looking at basically 2 lines of inquiry with this. One is the approach of a sort of updated 64-bit version of RISC OS. And then that would have to sort of be basically a 64-bit main Riscos with some sort of 32-bit emulation layer like Emula. It's a pretty scary project, to be perfectly honest with you, because 64-bit ARM instructions are wildly different to the 32-bit version. And the question then becomes, if you're having to write a wildly different operating system as your 64-bit Riscos, how much of the Riscos way of doing things do you need to keep? Would you be better at looking at new ways of tackling problems, preemptive multitasking and the like, while you're tackling 64-bit? But then at what point does it cease to be RISC OS at all? So these are the challenges facing us, and we want to work with as many programmers as possible to tackle these issues and see what can be done and work towards a common goal. The second way of tackling the nut will not go down well with purists, but may provide an interim measure for RISC OS, and that is to use a shim layer between RISC OS and the processor. There have been a few suggestions of exactly what form this shim would take. Essentially, we're talking about a bare metal other operating system, and I don't mean a full fat Windowsy type operating system. I mean a very lean, very small hypervisor, I suppose, ish layer of operating system between the CPU and Riscos, so that can present RISC OS with something that it can work with, if you like, a 32-bit emulated environment. Initial tests on this have shown that a fast ARM processor can actually get to almost ARMX6 speed doing that kind of thing. So this is not a completely stupid idea. And if that layer can be small and thin enough, then the experience of sort of starting up your computer is not going to be adding a second or two to the boot time, which you wouldn't even see. Bearing in mind that things like the Panda board used to take about 30 seconds to start up. If you've got Riscos still now starting up with a shim in sort of less than 10 seconds, I really don't see that that's too horrific a solution if it means that all of our existing applications can continue to run in the meantime. So these are two approaches, and I think honestly in the end will probably involve a bit of both. But this is a sort of active discussion that Riscos Development is having, both with Rule and with programmers. And this is something that, it's a very real problem, something that we're going to have to spend a lot of time and potentially a lot of money on. And that's essentially what you're doing when you're supporting Riscos Developments with your funding for the browser and for OBrowser and all the donations that you've made to Riscos Developments, is allowing us to fund these projects and make things happen. And we're really grateful that you've given us the opportunity to do that. As you know, for Richard and I, it's a labour of love. And, we're really pleased to be able to do what we can for the Riscos market. So, yes, I think at that point, I've probably said enough. And that gives us 6 minutes for questions. So over to everybody. If I close out that window, we should go back to me. And does anybody have any questions on what I have shown so far?
Yes, Andrew.
Yeah.
On the Iris browser,
Yes.
does it handle the document object model so that you can use JavaScript to write into blocks in the page?
Yes, I mean, that's a core part of the JavaScript interpreter. So, I mean, you wouldn't see the sites working that you saw today if it didn't support document object model. Basically, I didn't say in the Iris talk, is basically Iris is based on the WebKit engine, which is the same engine that supports Safari on the Mac. And it's what Chrome grew out of. I think they now claim that their own Blink engine, but the DNA goes back to WebKit. Essentially, all modern web browsers have WebKit DNA in their DNA. So we decided that that was a really good place to start, because if all modern web browsers on other platforms are using at least some derivation of WebKit, then WebKit was a really good place for RISC OS to be targeting too. Generally speaking, manufacturers put their own JavaScript engines in. Google have their V8 engine. WebKit has its own JavaScript engine, and that's where the JIT comes from. The JIT itself is actually quite exciting under the hood. There's a lot of new technologies that have never been done before on Riscos in that JIT. For example, the JIT, which initially kind of scared us because we didn't think it was going to be possible. The JIT is written in Thumb 2 ARM instructions, which is not something you normally see on Riscos. We thought that was going to be an unsurmountable one, but Jeffrey Lee managed to work some magic, and Thumb 2 is usable on Riscos. So thanks to both Lee Noor and Jeffrey Lee, two Lees, one at the end, one at the beginning, for their work on that. The other thing that was required for the JIT was, and to be fair, I don't fully understand this myself, I believe it's called M-mapped memory. It's to do with, as I understand it, presenting memory as equivalent of file I/O, so that you can essentially access memory files in the same manner, in a sort of agnostic way. It's how a lot of I/O is done on Linux, and is completely alien to how memory is handled on RISC OS. So basically, we've had to create a whole new memory paradigm in Iris to handle this, but without it, the JIT was not possible. Apologies if I've not explained this correctly, but basically, there's a whole load of totally new technology on Riscos that has never been possible before, present in Iris.
I have one question.
Yes?
Yeah, so regarding new TCP IP stack, it's definitely very interesting work. So I'm just wondering, it seems to be superseding their role, funding scheme. So what will happen with them? I guess they will be kind of phased out, or?
So it's replacing what? Sorry, I don't.
Yes, it seems to be superseding or replacing the rule bounties for the TCP.
Oh, the bounties. Yeah, I mean, effectively, the rule bounties is split into several phases. And in reality, when we tackled the project, we found that actually several of the later bits of the bounties slotted into effectively the first bit of the bounty. You couldn't do A without doing B and C, at least to some degree. So, that does leave the bounties open. There will, of course, be some work that Rule will want to do in terms of validating our work and bringing it into the main source tree. So I would imagine that the bounties will, it's not my place to say, so I've got to be a bit careful. But if I were Rule, then I would use a portion of the bounty money to help with the integration of what we've done with their build systems and sort of their presentation of RISC OS, as it were. I mean, we're providing them with the source code, but the bounty system will allow them to integrate that in a way that is practical for them. And then I believe that the bounties will likely just be rolled on to other bounties that they are working on. But as I say, that was not really my place to say. The point is that we've done it without needing to take their money. So that means their money is free to do other things with. And I think that's good news for the RISC OS community, that instead of Riscos developments trying to claim on Rule's bounty purse, which we could have done, we decided that we'd do it separately because we had the separate funding available to us. And that leaves the money free for all the other things that Rule are working on. So it just should mean there's more money to go around to do more projects, hopefully, or to make the existing projects better. So
sounds good. And then we avoid the duplicate work. I mean, there's no point in doing it twice. So there are other bounties we can then focus on. So sounds good.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else?
And Andrew, you've not touched on multi-core in your talk. Is there any news on?
I haven't. No. Basically, there's a whole lot of the sort of future bit that I didn't talk about because I could see that the time was clicking down, and I wanted to sort of try and not overshoot too much. Multi-core has to be on the roadmap, and Jeffrey's already made a lot of progress on that. You can download a ROM for an ARMX6 from our website that has multi-core enabled, and if you're a programmer, you can play around with that and try things out. If you're not a programmer, I probably wouldn't choose to use it because some bits of Riscos are not particularly multi-core friendly, so it would be an interesting experience to use it as a day-to-day build, but it is possible to some degree already. In a very real sense. Obviously we want to work with Jeffrey to expand on that and go forwards. I fear that 64-bit may be more of a looming threat than multi-core in the immediate term. It's a tricky one. Raspberry Pi offers us a get-out-of-jail clause for the foreseeable future in terms of 32-bit, in the sense that they have committed certain products to being available for the next 5 years. So if our goals don't exceed the Raspberry Pi Foundation's limitations, as it were, we do have a bit of time. But anything more exciting that comes along is currently off the table. So I think the 64-bit is really the elephant in the room that needs to be tackled. Although if there's low-hanging fruit in the multi-core world that Jeffrey can deliver, then absolutely, yeah. I mean, Riscos Developments is keen to support all. I mean, at the end of the day, we have a limited pot of funds, but we are keen to support as many projects as we can. And I was trying desperately not to talk money too much in this talk, because I know I put a few people off in my last talks talking about money, and I do apologize for that. But honestly, the more you guys can support what we're doing, if you feel, I mean, look at what we've done. You guys judge whether you like what we're doing. If you do, then please help, because the more things we can support, the more we can get done, and the more hopefully the more fun things we can do. there are things, there are people that we can't afford to pay because they cost too much money, for example. But we would like to give them, like to be able to afford to give them the work. So, anything you can do, really appreciated. If you bought O-Browser a few years ago, you're now seeing it on Pling Store as well. If you've got the funds, buy a copy on Pling Store as well. I don't know. Like I say, I didn't want to talk money because you guys, it's not. British people don't like talking about money, so let's leave it there on that. But clearly, we're keen to support and initiate as many of these projects as we can, either independently through our own means or by way of supporting Rule and their bounty scheme. There's lots of ways people can get involved. Absolutely. Any final questions?
Quick question about the Pling Store, Andrew.
Yes.
I just zoomed over there. When I moved over to the Pi 4, I just copied all my Pling Store over from the RISC PC. I've just noticed now the payment card details and personal details are blank. Do I just type it all in again?
Well, yes. I mean, depending on how you chose to, Pling Store lets you choose where and how much information you store because we wanted to treat such information securely. It doesn't store anything centrally on our servers because that would not be secure. It would leave us open to hacking and things like that.
Yeah,
The whole
got
point
that.
of Pling Store is to keep it local. So you may have saved stuff into boot choices, boot choices, Pling Store. You can copy that across, or you can retype it in and store it again. So
Yeah, fine.
So up to you.
Thanks.
Just a quickie, Andrew. I very much like the new Iris. I've installed it, and it's not too bad on the ARMX6. I can even run Facebook for the first time.
Yep, it does.
But I have a problem with the Python because the Iris, as you know, takes the shared lib, and I can't run Python afterwards. I've written some code that gets rid of Iris altogether and puts Python back. But when do you plan to tackle the incompatibility with Python?
Before the main release. For those who are unfamiliar, but Iris is cutting edge, bleeding edge, very state of the art, as I've said. Essentially, this means it's got technology in that basically hasn't yet fully come out through other means. So that means latest versions of the shared library system. Again, the JIT required updates to the shared library system to support Thumb 2. And various new kinds of executable and ways of doing things. It's very cutting edge, basically. So in order to allow users to run this in any kind of shape or form that's sort of doesn't require a degree in computer science to actually set it up, Iris includes its own version of shared libs and various other bits and pieces, which gets run when you first run Iris. That does effectively mean that other applications that are using shared libs are pushed out of the picture while Iris is being run. You can, I think, rerun the old shared libs afterwards once you quit Iris, although I must admit I haven't tried. And I know that some of our users have actually tried merging the two together. And I know on Forte, I have actually created a sort of combined one that seems to do Iris and Python in the same shared libs. But it did get rather unwieldy. It was sort of 500 megabytes of shared libs or something horrific. But it is possible to merge the two. In theory, it may even be as simple as just doing a boot merge. But Rake in Germany, I think, was saying that he's managed to do that. So I think it is kind of feasible. But what I found was that everything isn't quite hunky-dory in shared library land, in the sense, I have a feeling it may be that if you've got shared libraries compiled for both hard floating point and soft floating point, i.e. VFP or no VFP, with the same versions and names on different ABI versions and things, it may get a bit confused between all the different editions of things that it's trying to juggle in memory, which is possibly kind of understandable. But I may be wrong on that, so I may be doing it a disservice. Yeah. But it seems like something's not quite 100% there, which is why I've continued to do it the way that I'm doing it at the moment, is because that does work for people and allows you to run Iris and what have you. However, it's obviously a goal before a public release is made. That's before the 1.0, as it were, the free general purpose version. That has to be solved. But I can't give you a date on that.
Yeah, but you could satisfy with just one line of code, like restore the library that was there before. I don't mind when Iris is running, fine, I'm using Iris, but if I stop Iris, I'd like it to put it back so I could run something else. And it can do that by just rerunning shared lib. Now I can do that myself, but it's a bit of a nuisance.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to just mod, I believe it may that may just be as simple as modding the last. If you mod the run2 file in Iris, you could probably put a sort of rm-kill-so manager at the end to stop the current shared object manager, and then run another line that runs shared libs, and that would probably be sufficient. Not something I would want to do without checking it, because obviously if I put something out, it has to go out to a larger audience, and therefore I have to make sure it's all squeaky clean. I spent about 2 or 3 days this week going backwards and forwards with people, just trying to make certain things squeaky clean as possible. So yeah, but for your own use, just probably just put it as the last 2 lines of the run file should, when you quit Iris, then run those commands, kill shared object manager, load the system version, and away you go.
And Andrea, just some feedback on what I've discovered. Although I have to quit things like PDF and NetSurf before it will allow me to run Iris, having run Iris, I can then quite happily, without doing any more on shared libs, run NetSurf and other things. They seem quite happy to run with what Iris has set up, so far anyway. Yeah,
that's because those programs don't actually use shared libs, but do use something called shared Unix lib. Right. Again, I think it's actually in the README file, but probably only glossed over because it's more an exercise for the reader. But if you look inside Iris, if you shift double click Iris and go inside Iris and then resources, you will find the latest shared Unix lib, which I think is version 1.16. That's later than the 1.14. That's the sort of general purpose common release, I think. But if you were to merge that into your system, your Pling system folder, and replace the 1.14, you've probably got some in Pling system, then that would be used at power on, and NetSurf and things would use shared Unix lib 1.16, and that would then mean that you didn't have to quit PDF and NetSurf before running Iris. But other shared lib programs, the main shared lib programs I can think of are the Python applications, and I think MuPDF is shared libs based, and possibly one of the video players is possibly shared libs based. Just off the top of my head, there's not a lot, but there are. If you're into Python, then it is a bit of a downer. So yeah, apologies for that. But on the other hand, it's the trade-off between wanting to give as sleek an experience as we can, where people aren't just sort of getting weird crashes all over the place that make no sense, and this way we can present it in a way that for most people they can just run it and use it and off they go.
Can I just say thanks for your time and effort, and Richard and the programmers, and one question. How do you find the time?
Well, as you're about to find out, Chris, with the RComp talk, basically RComp has not been getting as much time as it should do. So food is getting harder to put on the table, let's put it that way. That certainly when you're working 35 hours, which was one particularly bad week on Riscos development stuff, it means RComp gets squashed, and I am aware that we haven't got as many new releases on RComp as I would like. But that's life. But thank you for your kind words. It is appreciated.
Your efforts are appreciated.
Thank you. You wouldn't believe how much that means to me, actually, because okay. Hi, John.
So I've asked my question. I should put my hand down, I suppose, shouldn't I?
Okay. I think I am going to have to do a cut there, because we are now 12 minutes in over the thing, and so whilst the RComp talk isn't going to be quite as sort of insightful as the Riscos development one, hopefully there is some good stuff still to be had. I think Ruth still seems to have input focus. Or at least for me, I'm seeing Ruth's PC care service being advertised. I don't know what there I am. I'm back again. Super. Thank you. Right. Okay. So now I'm going to screen share back to my Forte. I can find it in amongst the sea of windows that I seem to have now got open. So where are we? Zoom is where it's got minimized itself. Screen share to that window, share. Hopefully you're now all seeing my Riscos desktop. And if I just resize that one, pop that there, I have my notes for my RComp talk. Incidentally, at the top left here, you can see, because I'm running on one of our Forte computers, I've used the watermark feature of Pinboard 2 to put a little draw file in the top left corner indicating it's the Forte. Showing how draw files can be incorporated into a Riscos desktop there. Right, Forte has been our big release since Wakefield last year, which didn't happen. Forte launched in November last year, and we've been fulfilling back orders for the last 6 months. As of last week, we are now down to, I think, just one person waiting to have their order fulfilled. So we're almost there, light at the end of the tunnel. So if you're ordering after the show, we should be able to deliver your order fairly promptly now. So thank you to all of our customers for patience on this. Forte is our Raspberry Pi 4 based computer. It costs £250 or thereabouts, including VAT. And ships worldwide. Obviously, if you're outside the UK, you don't pay the VAT. So potentially, even with shipping, you can actually work out quids in. Forte is designed to combine both hardware and software. I will show the hardware for a second. So I'll just close this window and go back to my thing. I actually hold up a Forte. You've seen the in the previous talk in last October, you saw the 3 or 6 USB port version, 3 in the back, 3 in the front. We now have a 7 USB port version, which has the full 4 USB ports on the back and 3 on the front, and also incorporates USB-C into the design. So you have front panel USB-C access as well as traditional USB ports. Key features of the Forte include the on-off switch and power LEDs. You can see panels for DIY users cut in the side, so that if you want to mod the machine, bring out additional connections, do things via GPIO, that's perfectly possible. But the unit has a full housing. There's no gaps or what have you in terms of the back panel or how it's presented. It's a complete computer. The design takes cues from the RISC PC, whilst being small enough that you can put it in your pocket and carry it around. And indeed, some of the facilities that we've included in the Forte tool software that comes with it are based around the idea that many users will carry it around, plug it in, use it to do projections or Zoom meetings and the like. So it's designed to appeal both to new Riscos users. It ties into the Riscos Direct theme. You'll notice the RISC OS Direct logo there. It was done in collaboration with the people behind the RISC OS Direct videos. And also to existing users who receive a computer that they can just plug in and connect up, and off they go. It's our cheapest Riscos machine that we've ever produced, but that doesn't mean we've skimped on things like the software bundle or the hardware. The machine incorporates things like our acceleration technology, which allows applications to start more quickly. Iris, for example, can take up to 30 seconds off the SD card on a bad day, although we have improved that actually in the later. The very latest version includes some speed optimizations to start up. But it could take up to 30 seconds to load traditionally, but with the accelerator, we can get that down to 6 or 7 seconds. So that's obviously a nice feature of the machine. And it also incorporates built-in backup and data security, built-in recovery systems so that if you have problems, you can recover your machine, and also includes a vast swathe of Arcom software to allow you to make the best use of the machine. So if I now switch back to the screen sharing, you'll see a bit of the machine. Where are we? Incidentally, all this screen sharing is actually being achieved with, why is that not showing up in Zoom? Refresh the window, there we are. All of this all the screen sharing is being done with the Forte Tools software that we produce with the machine, which includes remote access facilities. So basically you just tick a button, we go to apps, Forte Tools, network, we can just click a button, enable VNC, set a password and click start VNC session. We can also enable it at startup. This basically means that with one click, we can make our machine available over the network, password protected, and just remote into it from another machine. I'm sitting in front of a Windows PC running Zoom, and I just literally, I have a VNC viewer on Windows, which has icons for each of my Riscos machines that are running software. I just click on the one I want, and in I go. Some of you may know that Raspberry Pis don't like running without a monitor, but I mean, one of the big uses of this is that you can run the machine headlessly, i.e. without a monitor attached, and use it just over the network remotely. I know that several of our customers use them on networks to do either run particular projects or run as servers, etc. And they just run them headlessly. And if we look in the display settings, there is a run headless at 1080p option. You just tick that, disconnect your monitor, Bob's your uncle, you get a 1080p desktop. So right now, this Forte does not have a monitor connected. If you try that out of the box with an ordinary Raspberry Pi, without a lot of fiddling around, you'll have all sorts of errors and things occurring because RISC OS and Pi really doesn't like not having a monitor connected at power on. With Forte Tools, you just tick a box and away you go. Another big aspect of Forte Tools is the built-in networking, which is particularly useful if you're taking the machine around with you. Literally, it's quite hard to demonstrate this because if I did, I would lose the network connection to it, and hence the window would disappear and we'd have to wait for it to come back. But basically, it has dynamic hot plug networking. So literally, you're in the desktop, you plug the cable in, it will auto-detect the network, sense the cable, configure the networking, fire up ShareFS. You can even set it to automatically share your drives and things. Or basically with no clicks or no nothing from the user, you just turn it on. If there's no network, it doesn't matter. Just go straight into the desktop, plug the cable in, auto setup, off you go. The reason why I'm talking quite a lot about Forte Tools, incidentally, goes on for item number 3, something called Pine Tools, which we've made available at the show. It's our show release, available on Plink Store. Pi Tools is essentially Forte Tools, but sort of with the Forte specific bits removed and a few extra goodies from Forte added in, so that anybody with a Raspberry Pi, if you choose to buy a machine that isn't from us or you choose to do it yourself, you can buy Forte Tool or buy Pi Tools and get the Forte Tool software and Forte operating system for an affordable price. It doesn't include all the vast swathe of other software that was included in a Forte. There's about £250 worth of software in a Forte. So you pay £250 for the machine, you get £250 worth of software. It's quite a good deal. You don't get that for just buying Pi Tools. That would be rather crazy. But basically, the idea behind Pi Tools is that we know there are other people who would like to have some of the facilities we offer on Forte, but either they're interested in building it themselves or, let's be honest, they just like a different case better. If that's you, then you can still support what we're doing with buying Pi Tools. and get the benefits of Forte tools. It also works on Pi 400 and things like there's some nice little bits in keyboard and mouse handling for Pi 400. Pi 400s don't have F12 key, so you can make F10 work like an F12. You can remap the flag key to work like a break key. You can change the mouse buttons around, all sorts of good stuff. PyTools also includes our lock screen technology for security, so you can make your machine password protected. You can do firmware updates, software installation. It has all kinds of monitor definition files, system error recovery, 4K support, super wide monitor support, so that you get correct aspect ratio on super wide monitors. A huge raft of stuff basically present in PyTools and Forte tools. Obviously, if you buy a Forte, you don't need to buy Forte tools. Buy a Forte, you don't have to buy PyTools because Forte comes with Forte tools. If you don't, then PyTools is now available. All the software that we supply on Forte is full version. So whereas on other things we may have done cut down versions of our software, Forte includes full release versions. So things like Fireworks is the absolute latest version of Fireworks, not just Fireworks, but Fireworks Professional in its full incarnation. Similarly, you get Safe Store, you get Messenger Pro, you get Network Printer Drive. I mean, there's Data Power, I think, in there as well. Delegate, Grapevine, Music CD, Easy Clip, PDF Suite. So there's programming tools, I think, in there as well. Chartwell, you name it. There's a shed load of software basically. We've also included a few of our games as well, including graphics. The version of Doom and Quake. The version of Doom includes the music, which you don't normally get elsewhere. And so we basically put on souped up versions of some of our games on there, and basically just lots of software covering all the key areas. You'll see impressions on there, and although I'm playing it down, there is a couple of HTML5 JavaScript web browsers on there as well, although nothing quite as state-of-the-art as Iris. But you do have HTML5 JavaScript web browsing on there, which means you have a good out-the-box experience both for email with Messenger and with web. So yeah, basically lots of good stuff in Forte. And as I say, we've been struggling to keep up with the demand for the machines. You've seen the new version with the extra USB ports. Internally, you can have either USB flash or SSD storage. One interesting thing is that with the Pi, all storage I/O is over USB. And on Riscos, that means USB 2. So basically, USB 2, regardless of whether you choose SSD or flash storage, you basically get quite a painful hit to performance, particularly for writing, which is always half the speed of reading, because due to the way USB 2 works, every write is accommodated by a read, and it can't happen at the same time. So basically, the hamstring of any Pi-based system is going to be the storage because of the crippling issues of the USB system. So frankly, whether you go USB with flash or whether you go USB with SSD, there is no practical difference in terms of performance, as long as you choose good quality items. However, as I will be talking later, we are looking to address some of those issues with the Raspberry Pi in due course. So watch this space. Yeah, so we call the software portion of the machine RISC OS Direct Plus, and we do have a plan, although I haven't yet actually made it available. We do have a plan to offer a complete disk solution of Riscos Direct Plus to ordinary Raspberry Pi owners, which will effectively give the whole of the Forte software experience, including updates and technical support and everything, as part of a support scheme. We're still working on the pricing. I'm expecting that to be about £100. And that would include Pi tools and everything on an SD card. But because obviously there's 250 quid worth of software, we've just got to work out exactly how we're going to price that for mass market consumption. Anybody who buys Pi tools will be able to upgrade to that. So don't feel like, if you're interested in that, don't feel like you don't need to buy Pi tools. If you buy Pi tools, you'll be able to upgrade to the full software kit if you so wish, once we've got that figured out and exactly decide what we're charging and how we're going to present it. As I say, it'll probably be an SD card and then access to the Forte downloads. But obviously the Forte still represents probably the best way to get that, both in terms of the hardware of the unit and the software together for a cracking price. Right. The next thing is cryptically titled Knight Rider Kit. I'm going to drop out of the remote session again so that you can see my hands. This is a prototype Forte that we've developed, and I do have some photographs, but I think, to be honest with you, if you see it live, you'll see what I'm on about. Let's get it in front of me so that you can actually see and it doesn't cut out. This is basically black and red. It reminds me of Kit and Knight Rider. And we have the idea to basically focus this on maximum performance. Knight Rider was famous for Kit doing a turbo boost, if you ever watched that particular TV show. And so we thought, well, if we get in with the Knight Rider Kit theme, incidentally, we can't call it Knight Rider Kit because that's obviously trademark names. But if we go with that kind of ethos, then we can make the Forte Turbo Boost with this model and go as fast as we possibly can. So this is a new Forte that we were planning to release in due course, optimized for performance, overclocking, cooling, etc. And we hope to have that available in probably the next couple of months. So yeah, that's a sneak preview of a product that is coming soon. If you're interested in sort of stretching, obviously with things like Iris, more performance, more power is always exciting. So that is the new next gen Forte. And if we switch back to the computer again. We talked a little bit about Pine Tools and Direct Plus. So basically, as I say, although not Pine Tools, Pi Tools. Let's get that right. Pine Tools was the version for the Pine book. Pi Tools, right? Okay, yes. Pi Tools. Basically, we've included as much functionality as we can, and there's, as I say, a few bonus bits for Raspberry Pi users in there. All stuff that's covered by the Forte software, so it's not, Forte users are not missing out, but there's as much value as we can packed into that. And you just buy it on Pling Store, you download it, comes with instruction manual, describes exactly what to do. You can put in the operating system or not, depending on your choice. If you want to use the Forte OS, it's there. If you just want to use the off-the-shelf Rule OS, you can use it with that. It doesn't matter. Obviously, there's certain benefits to using the Forte version, especially if you're running newer Pi hardware. But your choice. Pop that in and just drag Pi Tools to your apps folder, double click it, it will install itself automatically and give you access to all the functionality right away. We've got sort of a few Raspberry Pi oriented graphics I'm obliged to say that Raspberry Pi is a trademark of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, and that the software is not endorsed by the Raspberry Pi Foundation in any shape or form. Their guidelines are quite clear on what you can and cannot say with respect to the Raspberry Pi name. So yeah, Direct Plus being the full suite of software as we've discussed. Next up, we have the TIX or TIX. This is a system that I showed at the last at the London show, virtual show. Basically, a very high-end system, and I'll be totally straight with people. A TIX you can buy from us a Forte and a RISC Cube and get 90 to 95% of the same experience for half to 2/3 of the price. But the TIX is the sort of ultra high-end dream machine type thing that incorporates native ARM and native x86 in one box. What operating systems you choose to run on the x86 is up to you. There are a variety of choices of operating system that you can do with x86. But you can choose to have just an order, at the cheapest end, you could choose just to have a simple Windows browsing box as a very low entry system combined with your high-end Riscos system. And it combines it into one box with the 2 motherboards and 1 power supply. And links it all together, shares the resources between the 2. At the opposite end of the schedule, we have people running with sort of 16-core processors, video powerhouses on the Windows side, alongside their Riscos. And yes, it costs a lot of money, but one customer, he said to me, it would be either this or a Mac Pro. If he buys the Mac Pro, it costs him a lot of thousands of pounds. If he buys TIX, he gets the same level of performance and functionality, plus Riscos, and he saves himself £1,500 to buy an ARM-powered Mac Mini into the bargain. So, can be expensive, but compared to some of the other alternative products out there, TIX is actually relatively affordable. I mean, typically a TIX machine starts at about £1,500, although a fairly nice one would be sort of 2,000 to 2,500. Bear in mind that the RISC PC launched in 1994 money at about £1,700. So, I mean, anybody who bought a RISC PC back then has splashed out a lot more than this on a single computer. TIX gives you 2 computers, a full native ARM system, a full native Windows system, and the ability to share the resources between the 2. If I close this window and share the TIX desktop very briefly, I can only show a little bit of the TIX because I ran out of network cables and network ports on my switch in my workroom today, so please forgive me. That's a Windows desktop, I'm sorry. This is basically my work machine, which I'm in the process of transferring over to a TIX machine, TIX. I run different versions of Windows on different machines because it's how I can support different, whatever people bring in and ask for help on, I can support. So this is running a Windows 7. It shows how we can tailor the machines to whatever operating systems and things people want to run. So this particular one, the Windows side is set up to both run Riscos and Virtual Acorn. But of course, most people would want to run the Titanium side for their Riscos. So, I mean, that's quite understandable. But basically, you're getting 2 ways of running Riscos on there. It can also run Ubuntu in a virtual machine. Again, you can drive one machine from the other. If we look at the thing, you can see that there's the Riscos Titanium side of the machine. I only have it as a thumbnail because, as I say, I ran out of cables and things. so please forgive. But you can see there in the thumbnail the titanium Riscos desktop. And I've also set this machine up so it can also access my ARM-X6. Although that's probably not working because I think I already have a session open to that. So yeah. Oh no, there it is. There's the ARM-X6. So that is basically VNC through a VNC session. So I'm now nesting VNC sessions. But net result is that we can access, it shows the principle of how you can remotely operate your machines from one or other, or you can access them natively with the keyboard, mouse, monitor, etc. It's completely flexible. Files are shared with the file swap, which allows you to share files backwards and forwards between the two computers. You can have features like RAID arrays of hard drives in there, so that if you want to put your file swap on the RAID array, you can have drive redundancy, etc., while still making your data available to both platforms. So the native ARM processor can benefit from RAID. You can support the latest NVMe technology. You've got Wi-Fi support. You've got remote access. Basically, TIX will do anything you want, essentially, as best we can. Some people will want to sort of see the actual hardware. I'm now going to try and make the camera come with me. I'm going to have to remove the virtual backdrop to do this, I think. Choose virtual backdrop, none. Hopefully now we can track this with my camera.
And
so
screen sharing.
Screen sharing. Good point, folks. Thank you. So we're now, I feel like an episode of that one where they went around people's houses. So I don't know whether you can see, I put some fancy lighting in with a water cooler overnight last night. So at the bottom you have the titanium board, and above it the PC board. You can actually switch them around, so you can have the titanium board at the top if you want a larger PC board beneath. I just went with a smaller PC board because that's all I needed. It's still got an NVMe drive, water cooling, i7 processor. It's a nice bit of kit. So yeah, if I pan out, that is the Pci. Essentially, we build them as beautifully and as technology state of the art as we can, subject only by budget and resources. So if you have an interest in combining Riscos OS and Windows in one box, or just simply fancy a really cool computer, then please consider the Pci. Right, okay. Back to that, and if I put my virtual background on. Okay, right. Next item also requires me to throw things around and show you things. So back to me again. I now have to open a box. Another thing that we've been doing a lot of recently is mini RISC cubes. We still do the full-size RISC cubes, and they still should be a key part of our business. But the mini ones have been quite popular recently, especially people buying, say, a mini one of these and a Forte, because, of course, that takes up virtually no space on your desk. So if you can see, I think I better take the virtual backdrop off again. How do we do this? Video, choose virtual background, none. Okay, so basically, if you can see, this is basically a square thing that's about the size of a moderately thick paperback book, nowhere near as thick as a hardback Harry Potter. Essentially, this crams in a quad-core PC, effectively no compromises, with HDMI DisplayPort, USB 3.1 and 3.2. So that's got the latest 10 gigabit and beyond performance. You've got super speed USB, USB-C connections for phones with all the necessary performance that entails. You've got audio, you've got networking, you've got Wi-Fi built in, you've got Bluetooth built in. You know, that's an awful lot of functionality. And the brilliant thing is that we can do these at pretty good prices. Depending on it varies depending on your storage and your RAM and whether you want Riscos on it and things like that. But I mean, you're talking about prices of sort of 500 to 750, which, given some of the prices that we have had to charge in the past, I think you'll agree that that's a pretty competitive pricing for a heck of a lot of functionality. And also included in the price is a monitor mount kit. So you can actually take this machine and put it onto the back of a monitor, and then literally you can hide it behind your monitor and just press the on-off button on the thing to turn it on, and it takes no space on your desk, and you have a completely transparent machine, and just have your keyboard, mouse, and monitor effectively, and that can run Windows, it can run Riscos, it can run the two together, you can do the remote stuff, and if you would like, we can do a lot of the things that we do with the Pci, but with a Forte and one of the mini PCs, or mini RISC cubes. So that's proven to be quite a delightful product recently for people, just because there's so much functionality in such a tiny box, really. And of course, people like tiny computers, don't they? Especially when you can, you cram the functionality of a big giant PC into a big little teeny tiny PC. Yeah, lots of fun. Right. So enough of me on camera. Back to the notes. I think I made a mistake putting my notes of my talk actually on a VNC session, but it seemed clever at the time, but having to go backwards and forwards to the VNC is nowhere near as slick as I would like. Now then.
Just to make you aware, Andrew, it's 1:15.
Thank you. Right, well, we're getting on. I think I'm going to skip forward because if time's running out, I think you'll all want to see Project PyTX, because I said there weren't going to be any particularly exciting things, but I think Project PyTX might just catch your fancy, or at least I hope it does. You heard me earlier talk about the fact that Raspberry Pis have rubbish disk I/O. It's their Achilles heel, and it's why, despite selling Fortes and really loving Fortes, and Fortes being absolutely cracking machines for the price, a lot of my work still ends up being done on an ARM X6, which is a technically slower processor, but it has native SATA and SSD. Wouldn't it be nice to have both? I give you PyTX. PyTX is a board that we've designed in collaboration with 7th ARM. And basically, it's designed to solve the problems of the Raspberry Pi when it comes to Riscos, and just be a jolly exciting project. It's designed around the Raspberry Pi compute module, which basically gives the functionality of a Raspberry Pi 4, but without the form factor of a Raspberry Pi 4. You do still have to supply quite a lot of your own chips. There's a lot of things the Raspberry Pi compute module doesn't do, but that's why there's a whole bunch of other chips on this motherboard. ITX is the standard form factor in the PC world for small PCs. It provides room for effectively the back panel of a PC case plus one expansion slot. So it's a neat form factor, gives you a wide range of cases and a wide variety of prices, styles, and everything else. And basically, PyTX is designed to deliver all the good things that you could possibly want to do as best we can at a vaguely deliverable price. Let's be honest, designing a motherboard is horrifically expensive. Certainly bringing it to production is. We're talking about, probably 10K plus. It's a huge project. So don't expect this to be a dirt cheap thing. If you're looking for a cheap computer, Forte is brilliant. But Forte isn't the solution to every problem. And so that's where this comes in. Essentially, what we've done is to take the compute module and add in, as a heart, is a PCI Express switch. This is an expensive part that basically takes the PCI Express bus of the Raspberry Pi 4 and allows multiple things to connect to it. So that instead of having to have just one thing connected, which on a Raspberry Pi 4 would be the USB 3 controller, we can have multiple things connected to it. Basically, the more things you want, the more expensive the chip costs, but and it does get quite frightening. But we've split it a few ways. I think it's 3 ways on this version. Each with a PCI Express switch, each just like a network switch, each port gets full speed. So essentially, it allows us to deliver maximum throughput multiple ways. You can see that on the left-hand side of the board, there is an actual PCI Express expansion slot. Then we have a native SATA controller with 4 ports. You've got 3 down the side of the board and an M.2 format 1. M.2 is our favorite format for drives because you can just slot them in and you don't need to have lots of cable spaghetti. You just click the drive in, screw it down, and away you go. Some will say, if you know M.2 and the PC world and PCI Express, you'll say, why is it SATA only? Why isn't it NVMe? Short answer is Raspberry Pi performance. You get 4 outputs with the. We decided that we had to have a SATA chip because we want to connect more than one device to the board. If you're going to do that, a SATA controller on the PCI Express bus gives 500 to 600 meg a second. If you look at the capabilities of the Pi's PCI Express bus, NVMe PCI Express based SSDs, the bandwidth of the Pi's PCI Express controller is not enough to do due diligence to an NVMe SSD. So essentially, back of a postcard calculation suggested to me we're actually about probably slower than the peak of SATA going over NVMe. The same restriction would apply to the SATA, just to be clear, because they're both going over the PCI Express bus. But nevertheless, going PCIe would have basically meant we had to have a 4th way split on the PCIe chip, PCIe switch. More cost for the same performance. It just didn't make sense. If you want NVMe storage, you can plug in via the PCI Express slot on the left-hand side. But honestly, the performance level is going to be plus or minus 50 megabytes a second. It's negligible when we're already talking about hundreds of megabytes a second. So that's why SATA only on the M.2. You've got fan connectors, you've got front panel connectors, you have GPIO expansion for both Pi 0 boards and full-size hats. You have USB 3, although of course on Riscos that's still likely to be limited to USB 2 speeds. Gigabit networking, essentially all the features of the Pi Compute module brought out on the back panel with the storage of that you would want from a modern computer and the bits and pieces. The big challenge right now with PyTX is simply production. There is a chip shortage on. Parts are scarce. The board is, as you can see, designed. It's simply a case of getting hold of the components and finding production capacity to get the board manufactured and built, and that's costing a lot of money. So if there are any, if this excites anybody out there, please get in touch. I mean, we are proceeding ahead as best we can and trying to locate parts and components as best we can in order to get prototypes and things put together. We're still obviously a few months away in terms of being able to do that, but the board is designed, it's ready to go. And compared to sort of other Kickstarters for this kind of project that we saw that run everything over an internal USB 2 bus, I think it's pretty clear that using the PCI Express and native parts for SATA and USB 3, PCI Express Expansion, etc., is the way to go, the way to tackle this. So yeah, Project PyTX is particularly exciting for us in future. And Pi Foundation have confirmed availability to, I think, 2028 for the compute module. So it should give some kind of longevity to the product, assuming we can get the components in and these stock shortages resolve themselves. We have about 6 minutes left. Right. Fireworks and other apps. I think I'm going to probably skip on the fireworks. If you haven't seen the demonstrate, oh, no, quick, very, very quick fireworks demonstration, if I can just find the example files. And this is basically the latest feature that we added at back end of last year to Fireworks, which is dynamic data sharing between applications. So if we load up TechWriter, for example, we can do fun things like taking our little table of data. So you can use, firstly, you can use Fireworks to make tables, a bit like TableMate or something like that, which is quite a nice little thing. And then we can drop that into Fireworks. Sorry, not into TechWriter, EasyWriter, TechWriter. Also works with Impression and the latest version of Ovation Pro. The point is that this remains fully editable. So we've saved our document into there, but we can just double click it. It loads it straight into Fireworks. If we change that to editing cell, find editing in the cell to be more natural. And you can see that has now changed to 40 degrees, like in the original spreadsheet. That in and of itself isn't hugely interesting, although obviously the ability to share data and have it dynamically update is pretty cool. What is a lot more interesting is if we then take the graphing capabilities of Fireworks. If we highlight this data set, and we make a line graph of it, for example, and we plot that there. And then we say, actually, we would like to embed that graph in TechWriter. Well, oops. Never try and do a demonstration too quickly. On page 2. And there's our graph in TechWriter. Now what we have here is now a data-backed graph. So we could type around that and sort of, use TechWriter as we would normally do, and we can blah blah blah. We can put in an equation. I can remember how to do that. I don't have the fonts installed, so let's not do that. But you create your TechWriter document about your graph, but then you discover that you've got a new data set. You need to change the data. So what do? Well, because our graph is actually data backed, we control double click on it. We see that there's our table of data. We decide that on Thursday it wasn't 15 degrees, but in fact it was -2. And you can see that the hold on a minute. What's going on with that? -2 wasn't a good idea. Let's say it was 5 degrees. I see. There we are. So we see our graph has changed. So all we do is we save the changes, and lo and behold, our graph in TechWriter has now been updated to contain the fact that it was 5 degrees on Thursday rather than 15. We can change that again, I believe, and decide that it was actually 55 degrees on Thursday. And we all got very sick indeed. And once I've saved that, you can see our graph now reflects the changes. We don't need to keep that fireworks document. It's embedded within the TechWriter document. So on our hard drive, all we have to do is save that EasyWriter document. You can close that. Later date, we open the thing. There's our chart. And if we want to modify it again, we just Control double click on it and we change that back to 15 degrees where we started and press to save. And boom, our graph is now back to normal. So that shows basically how the latest version of Fireworks Professional can be used with other applications, be they Impression, Ovation, TechWriter, EasyWriter, to bring spreadsheets and graphs together as a single dynamic entity with the documents that you're creating. The latest version also included enhancements to Excel handling, I think to mail merge, some user interface improvements. Fireworks Pro includes both import and export of Excel, by the way, including multi-workbook documents. I think there's I think it's in examples. I have a rather ugly one. Where are we? Spreadsheet. No, not that one. That's just 2 pages of data. Let's be sample. Yeah, here we are. This has 14, I think, different pages of data in it. And basically, when you open it in TechWriter, it basically creates a series of linked spreadsheets linking them all together so that you can open an Excel workbook containing multiple linked spreadsheets. When you save them, it saves them you can save them in Excel format. You can incorporate, the software has a whole set of functions that are designed to mirror the functions present in Excel and also the OpenOffice spreadsheet or LibreOffice spreadsheet. So that those functions can be used automatically when exporting to contain, so that you get function compatibility, or importing and exporting to give you function compatibility with your spreadsheets when used on other platforms. So that's the latest Fireworks. Not much time for other things. There's been improvements to, I think, network printer drivers, Messenger Pro, tweaks to Music Man, lock screen and stuff all over the last couple of months. If you want to know more about those, ask me. Networking and NAS before we finish, just closely. We do an awful, as many of you may know, we do an awful lot of networking products, particularly specializing in network attached storage and network printing. Network storage basically means having hard drives available on your network to all your computers. A lot of people think they don't need this or it's not relevant to them. Most of you own more than one computer or device, whether it's an iPad or a tablet, a phone, a PC, a Mac, a Riscos machine, a Raspberry Pi, or several Raspberry Pis, an ARM-X6 or whatever. You own more than one device these days. I'm sure there's somebody who doesn't, but the vast majority of us own multiple devices. If you own multiple devices, you owe it to yourself to have some kind of network storage to share data between them. Particularly a multi-disk one, sort of 2 drives or 4 drives, so that you've got redundancy and against failure, so that if a drive dies, you're covered. Network storage is a particular, as I say, particular favorite of mine. And one of the exciting things with Iris, just going backwards a second, this will be a tad slow, but I think it's incredibly cool. One of our favorite brands of NAS is QNAP, because they pack a lot of functionality into a fair price. they use an entire operating system written in JavaScript. NetSurf won't go anywhere near it.
Really just sorry to cramp your style, Andrew, but time is getting on.
Yep. This is going to be my last.
Yeah, well, you may want to take one or two questions afterwards.
Okay.
Leave that to you.
Well, yeah, that'll cut into lunch, so if people want to go to lunch rather than talk.
Yeah, there's some very loud rumbling noises coming from my stomach.
All I wanted to show was the fact that the QNAP operating system used by their NASes does indeed work in Iris. I updated my NAS yesterday, and the apps that come with it. Where are we? Entirely through Iris. Basically, it's an entire operating system with drag and droppable windows, complex user interface, you can see the pop-ups, entirely written in JavaScript, and entirely working in Iris, which is, I mean, I didn't think it would be even vaguely usable, but as you can see, it is doable. We can leave the page and exit out, and that's entirely working within Iris. The QNAP NASes allow you to do all manner of file sharing, cloud access, printing capabilities, virtual machines. There's a huge amount of functionality. So if you've got any interest in shared drives, shared storage, local servers, anything like that, give me a shout. Happy to talk at length. And with that, I will say thank you to everybody for listening. It's been a long session. I apologize for that, but hopefully there's been some exciting stuff in there, at least the web browsing and stuff that you've been able to enjoy. Anybody have any questions?
A quick fireworks question. My fireworks says 2.30B2, 21st of October. The one on the Pling store is 24th of October, and it's just 2:30. Is there a difference? Is there any point in?
I think the current version. I'll need to check. To be honest with you, some things have got away from me a bit, as I did say earlier, with the limited time. The current version is 2.30.1 of Fireworks Pro. So if P stands like it's the preview version.
So B for Bertie 2.
Oh, B. Okay.
Bravo 2.
That was. I mean, it's probably just the release, the sort of day before the show version, and then I think
yeah, right.
30.1 had a small bug fix or two in shortly after the show. If it hasn't made its way up there, apologies. I will check into that tomorrow.
How do I upgrade if necessary?
Well, I mean, if you assume most people have bought it through Pling Store, if you've got physical, I mean, basically, if you put your version number on how you obtained it in the special instructions when you put an order in on Pling Store, I won't charge you if you've already on the sort of 2.30 subversion. There's a small fee if it's an older version.
Right, okay, I'll sort that out with you.
Basically, the special instructions is the key. I always read that when the orders come in, and if there's no charge, then I'll just approve it. Even though it looks like you're buying it, you can put nonsense card details in. I'll just click approve, and you'll get the software.
Lovely, thanks.
Anybody got any other questions? I haven't been able to look at the chat, so I've got no idea what's been going on while I've been talking. So.
Hi, so just a quickie one here on RISC OS Direct. You said you got a lot of SD cards lying around in a shed somewhere. Just a thought, would it be worth distributing some of these to clubs and then people can pay an amount to RISC OS Direct as a bulk thing if they decide to take up those cards?
It's a thought. I mean, we really wanted the actual, what we were concerned about, why we haven't done that, is that we really wanted the personal contact, because what we were concerned was you send them a bunch of cards and they just reformat them and use them for Linux.
No, well, I mean, we could possibly distribute at our end if we know people.
I see. You're thinking about
say,
in my head, I'm always thinking about non-Riscos users. So
yes, yeah.
The idea is, I mean, the nicest way, a Riscos user will gladly pay £10 for a card to cover the cost of the card.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking.
12-year-old at a Pi Jam is not going to pay money to try out an operating system.
No.
So the key thing with the project was that we were basically out of Riscos developments. We were able to raise a small amount of money to buy the cards. And the idea is that we were going to put the legwork in to actually make up the cards and then give them out, but only to want people who actually engaged with us. We didn't want to just hand them out and then just get them reformatted. If they engaged us, talked to us about what we were doing and showed an interest, then the cards would go out, because I think if you can actually engage with the person who's trying it, they're more likely to actually put it in and use it. And even if they just bounce off it and reformat it after they've done that, at least we've tried. And at least, they walk away having heard of Riscos. And even that is a win. And they think positively at Riscos, because Riscos was the company that gave them a free SD card to try. And it's hearts and minds at the end of the day. So I mean, we're happy to supply the clubs. Sort of, I did wonder about sort of Big Ben Club in Holland as being good.
Yeah, the thing is, obviously, you could post.
In terms of costings, I mean, basically, contributions appreciated, but as I say, the whole point was to give things away free to people who wouldn't normally pay to access Riscos, because the sort of we're trying to. With a lot of what we've done with the open sourcing and things, it's trying to remove the paywall from Riscos for new blood, but there has to be a paywall because we can't all operate on thin air. It's a constant battle. That Riscos is my day job. It's how I feed Steph and the family, and it's how I keep a roof over the head. So I need to do stuff. But on the other hand, you'll never get new customers if they don't know what's on about.
It's doing that balancing trick.
And our audience is, unfortunately, all, for a vast majority of it, is over 50. I'm often considered one of the young ones, and I'm closer to my pension than not. So, we need more new blood, and we need.
So we should buy the web browser on the what's on Pling Store, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Andrew. So.
Web browser? It's not.
So if you want to go for lunch and things, feel free to do so. But I will stay on for the next half hour or so if anybody else wants to ask questions or just discuss or shoot the breeze with me, or shoot the breeze amongst themselves for that matter.
Did you just say that web browser was on the Pling Store?
Yeah, it's under O browser. Basically, please think of it as purchasing O browser and donating to support Riscos developments. Please do not think of it as buying Iris.
Right.
I know it's a subtle.
I can see it.
I know it's a subtle distinction, but and the other thing I didn't say is that because it is effectively donationware, if you're going to use it on more than one computer, pop a note in the special instructions and do think about pledging a wee bit more than the standard asking price. We did used to say 100 quid if you're going to use it on lots of machines, and that shows. But I'm not to a particular figure, but if people can justify a bit more, every little helps, as Tesco would say. But on the other hand, like I said, don't want to go on and on about money because I know how much that upsets people. So,
it is there. I've just bought it and added a small donation.
You're a brilliant hero, sir. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I have that in writing, please? My wife.
Expect an email later. If you give me a Steph has brought tea. Oh, you're a star. Thank you. What's left of a Riscos Developments mug as well. So keep calm and enjoy Riscos.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was very, very interesting, very useful.
Thank you.
Very entertaining. Thank you.
Hopefully I haven't put too many of you to sleep.
I've asked you to send the new pin board. I just did it to the RComp address. Is that all right?
Yeah, doesn't matter. It all goes to me eventually. There's Andrew at riscosdev.com or any of the RComp ones, and I'll bounce that up, chuck that over to you. I will say, just for clarity, the the way Pling Store works, all transactions are run through RComp's or RComp Interactive's payment facilities. That doesn't mean that RComp is pocketing your money when it comes to things like overroutes and things. But when you saw it on your credit card statements as coming from RComp or RComp Interactive, I can imagine that some people would raise an eyebrow. Essentially, the way it works is that Pling Store RComp gathers the money and then disperses it to the software developers periodically.
Andrew, going back to the 64-bit question. So I guess it comes back down to what is Riscos and what makes us use Riscos. Is it the apps or is it the OS? Because you could envisage a two-pronged sort of attack on it. You could say, like you were saying, a shim to run Riscos as we know it, or with a 64-bit version, aka doing something like Apple has done. Yeah. And I guess it comes down to
effectively two approaches. I mean, if you look at Apple, I mean, they've made multiple switches of hardware and indeed the operating system that, you know, the modern Mac OS X, or whatever they want to call it these days, bears very little resemblance in terms of code to what they started with Mac OS 1 to 9. You know, the modern one is based on NEX, the BSD core. So
what did it catch on? I think what it catch on. On the head next door.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, basically Apple have done it several times, but on the other hand, Apple have they're the biggest, the richest company software company in the world, or computer company in the world, as far as I know. So they do have the resources to do it. It's the one thing I can say is that hardware is not what makes Riscos. That was the mistake that was made back in the Acorn era when they first tried to sort of buy out the Phoebe before Riscos Limited happened. There was an aborted attempt to continue on Phoebe production. Hardware is not, it's in and of itself what makes Riscos. Riscos and the software that runs on it is what makes Riscos. So I think anything that we do has to acknowledge that, you know, without the programs that we use and the feel of the operating system, then we might as well just be using Windows and Mac. So whatever we do has to accommodate the software, and we can't be losing more software. You know, when we went to 32-bit, thankfully we had Emula, but otherwise we'd have lost an awful lot of software. 64-bit is potentially far worse, because whereas 32-bit was effectively the same instructions, but with an alteration of how you use the address space and how you present, you know, the address space to the instructions. Essentially, you couldn't do the naughty tricks that people were doing previously. 64-bit is a whole new set of instructions that work in a rather different way. I think you have an awful lot more registers, for example. And so translation of 32-bit, 64-bit is not a simple task. And that's why in the immediate term, we might have to look at some sort of emulation shim to make it practical to continue running our 26, 32-bit software. The key is basically to make that as subtle, for want of a better term, as possible, so that the experience of the user is not one of using an emulator, but rather of a native computer that just happens to have a shim that you never see in the background. So yeah, I'm sure Riscos, I should notice so much. Riscos Open will have something to say on this, I'm sure. And obviously, in the meantime, if we can bring PyTX to market, then that provides us with a stopping gap for the next few years for PyCompute modules and things. But obviously, it'd be nice to go beyond the capabilities of Raspberry Pi and move on to newer hardware. I had intended, if time had permitted, to show the Rockchip ports for Riscos, but I ran out of time. So sorry, you don't get to see the rocket ports. It's still a long way from maturity. I was in two minds of whether to show it anyway. It does mean you can run Riscos on some interesting devices, but at the moment there are an awful lot of holes, and it boots off a USB stick on USB 1 speeds, for example. So not necessarily what you'd want to see. But I did get an example running last night just in case. But I think we have plenty to discuss as it was.
Yeah, and I guess, Andrew, this, your bit about not doing multi-core, it comes back to this other fundamental.
Just to be clear, not doing it. We want to have a lot of irons in the fire.
Yes.
But if push comes to shove, I personally would say that we need to have more of an eye on 64-bit than multi-core, because without some sort of solution to that, we could be really up a gum tree in 5 years.
Yeah, and I think
if we had 64-bit but no multi-core, then we're still going. If we don't have 64 but we do have multi-core, we're stuck with the computers that more or less that are available today, and that's going to look very dry in 5 years' time. That's why I'm looking at it like that. So I'm not trying to scare people, because we've managed to rise to the challenge. I would say we as a community, not we as our company, we as Riscos Developments. As a community, we've risen to the challenge. Riscos Open, particularly Jeffrey Lee. I mean, just look at Iris with what Lee Moore has been able to achieve. As a community, we there's a lot of talent in there. I don't believe this is insurmountable, but I think if we don't think about it and come up with and try and help in any ways that we individually and as a collectively can, we're going to end up hitting the buffers in a few years' time in a way that will be quite ugly. So we need, it's got to be there. We've got to have plans. We have people looking at it, but this is not something that one person is going to crack on their own, I don't think. I mean, never say never to Jeffrey, but equally, I don't. That puts a lot of pressure. I'm sorry, Jeffrey. We've seen people do amazing things, so I'm not going to say never. But on the other hand, it is an epic undertaking, and we need to tackle it as such.
Yeah, I guess it was a poor choice of words I used there, Andrew. I was just trying to use the thing that, like you said, is about priorities. Do you concentrate on filling missing gaps to the detriment of not having anything to run on if you're not careful?
Yeah, I think we've got to balance it. I mean, certainly Riscos Developments isn't going to put all of our irons into that one fire. We've got projects like the pinboard, the TCP/IP, the browser, etc., that we're doing. There'll be more to come. So we're very aware that we need to deal with things. You've seen that with the networking, we're looking towards tackling the Wi-Fi. Bluetooth, I see Timo on. I think Timo is looking at Bluetooth side of things. So Bluetooth is something we want to support, but I don't really want to talk about it at this stage because there's nothing to say. But these are projects that we want to support and we want to happen quietly in the background. USB 3 comes to mind as well. But it's balancing the limited program availability and time, the cost of, some of the rule guys, for example, would work on Riscos projects if we funded their time, but we put simply, we can't afford them because they're used to proper salaries. And whilst Riscos Developments does try and pay, fair amounts of money out, real world Cambridge rates would burn money quite quickly, and we've got to still be around in 5 years' time. and we don't keep doing whip rounds and things, or try to. In the last few newsletters, I've purposely not asked for funding because, right now we are okay to do what we're doing. The projects that everything I've announced is funded for now, but yeah, I mean, we're having to look at projects, what we could achieve with different levels of funding, and who's available, who we can pay to do the work, which projects we tackle. There's the rule bounty scheme there as well for people to come in through. So there's a lot of approaches that are being used to bring programmers in, develop things, and keep those irons in the fire. So yeah, I mean, I've tried to show a variety of things today of ways in which ROD and RComp can contribute to the scene and bring our much-loved operating system forwards. But, as I say, we do all need to think 64-bit. In a way, I'm scaring people to make them aware, because if you don't know it's out there, you need to plan accordingly, even if that just means buying an extra sort of 32-bit machine in the meantime, just stuck under the desk as a spare. It's just, you guys need to be aware that this is a looming thing, and that it's something we are looking at, we are trying to work towards. And sometimes people have been sort of a bit down on certain approaches on the forums, certainly the emulation approach, it gets a lot of flack from the purists, and I get that, but I think people need to understand that this is not something that we're going to skin just with one thing. There's almost certainly going to be different ways of tackling this nut. And as long as those applications run, as long as Riscos and the Riscos desktop and the feel of the machine is not compromised. I think if you sort of look at emulation on a virtual Acorn, for example, or RPCMU, there is an ethos that people don't like, the fact that it's reliant on Windows or Linux or Mac or what have you. But also the experience means that you have to wait for Windows to boot up. You have to load virtual. The RPCMU, I think it's still has to start in a window, and then you've got to go full screen. The experience is not slick. It's not what Riscos is about for a lot of people, where it's turn their computer on and sort of a few seconds later they're in a Riscos desktop, boom. And then the other aspect of emulation that people don't like is the fact that often the emulation is of Riscos, a RISC PC, with all the limitations that imposes. I don't see why an emulation needs to be of a RISC PC. That seems ridiculous to me, that if you're going to emulate something, what you want to emulate in your shim is a much more generic system that has an ARM processor that is 32-bit ARM v7. I mean, yes, you could have a flavor that's 26-bit for those that really want to run 26-bit software natively without Angular, but I would envisage a sort of 32-bit shim. And as I say, that kind of thing is eminently possible. It has been demonstrated that something like that is possible, but it just needs the right development resources to happen. But that would, I think, if done right. I mean, I always thought Virtual Acorn ought to evolve that way into a sort of not emulating a RISC PC, but rather emulating a sort of dream RISC PC, for want of a better term, a dream piece of Acorn hardware, tying into the various subsystems that were exposed by Windows, 3D graphics, multi-channel sound, video acceleration, could all have been filtered through somehow into the Riscos paradigm. And especially when they were developing Riscos 6 at the same time, they could have merged. You could have had video acceleration through DirectX, etc., tied into a Riscos 6 component that interfaced with that through Virtual Acorn. And you could have created something that was not just an emulation of a RISC PC, but an emulation of a perfect ARM system almost, incorporating, essentially letting the host operating system do the legwork for you on the difficult bits, whilst Riscos plugged into it to offer that to a user. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well.
Andrew, we're almost ready to start the next talk.
Oh, right. I thought that was 2:30.
It's okay.
Oh, sorry. Okay. But anyway, I just final comment is that I don't see the shim layer being something that's anything like Windows or anything like that. It needs to be something that's completely transparent.
Thanks for clarifying that, Andrew. Excellent addition to your talk.
Yep, you'll have to book 3 hours next time, Andrew.
There's always more to say. But,
yeah, no, all good stuff. All good stuff.
Hopefully, people found something of interest in what I had to say. That's all I can ask.